The window of the small shop, Ayana Izzy, was hung with garlands of dried flowers. Inside, the scent of earth, freshness, and the sweet aroma of peonies filled the air. Ayana was trimming stems, lost in her usual rhythm, when a shadow fell across the door. 3 people entered. They didn't ring the bell. Men in perfectly tailored suits, their faces expressionless. They filled the entire space at the counter, and the air grew heavy. "The store is closing," said the one in front. His voice was as even as the horizon. "You have 1 hour to gather your personal belongings." Ayana slowly set down the pruning shears. Her palm rested on the old wooden counter, worn by time and her own hands. The movement was familiar. This was her territory. "Mine's open right now," she replied, looking him straight in the eye. "And I plan to be open until this evening. You can buy something or move on." The corner of one of the men's mouth twitched. Not a smile, more like mild bewilderment. They were clearly expecting tears, screams, panic. Not this quiet firmness. "The land and building have been transferred to a new owner," the leader continued. "Everything is legal. Your lease is canceled." "My grandmother opened this shop," Ayana said, her voice louder than she'd expected. "I was born and raised here. My lease is still valid for another 6 months. Show me your papers and call my lawyer. Until then, you're just visitors." A subtle shift passed between the men. They weren't used to being contradicted, especially not by women in aprons stained with dirt. The one speaking took a step forward, and Ayana instinctively backed away toward the counter where the heavy garden shears lay. He noticed and stopped. At that moment, the doorbell rang again. Everyone turned. Another man stood in the doorway. He, too, was wearing a formal suit, but it was dark gray, almost black. He wasn't large, but his posture, the way he stood motionless, exuded absolute confidence. His gaze swept over his men, and they instantly stepped aside, making room. Then that gaze fell on Ayana, cold, scrutinizing, devoid of any interest. He looked at her like a piece of furniture that needed to be assessed before being discarded. "I am Jin," he said. His voice was low and calm, without threat. That was the danger. "This is my land now. Everything here is mine." Ayana clenched her fists behind the counter. His simplicity was more frightening than his scream. "This is my home," she breathed. "You can't just come in and say something like that." "I just did," Jean remarked. He didn't go any further, remaining at the threshold, as if unwilling to dirty his shoes on the old floorboards. His eyes slowly scanned the room, the shelves lined with watering cans, the refrigerator filled with flowers, the dried ivy on the beam, the photograph of a smiling elderly woman on the wall. "You have a week. Pack your things. Say goodbye to this place." Ayana's heart sank into a void. A week. But along with the panic came a wave of heat, a stupid, reckless anger. "No," she said. For the first time, Jin showed any reaction. His eyebrows rose slightly, a millimeter. "No, I'm not leaving in a week. I'm not going anywhere. My contract, my rules. You have no right." He paused, looking at her. He looked at her stubbornly raised chin, her shining eyes, her hands gripping the edge of the counter so tightly that her knuckles turned white. He said finally, and there was no approval in his tone. It was a statement of fact, like the weather. But bravery doesn't change the facts. In exactly 7 days, work will begin here. If you and your belongings are still here, they will become part of the construction debris. The choice is yours. He turned to leave, his coat flapping in a gentle motion. Ayana shouted after him. Jin turned around, impatiently, as if he had been distracted from something important. "Why?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Why this particular neighborhood? It's quiet here. Ordinary people live here." He held that icy gaze on her for another moment. "Because he's in my way," Jean said simply. "And now you are too." And he left. His men followed him silently. The bell rang one last time, and the shop fell silent, broken only by the frantic pounding of Ayana's heart. She glanced around her kingdom. Every pot, every dried flower, the water stain on the floor. A week. He said it as matter-of-factly as one might talk about the expiration date of milk. She rested her head on the cold wood of the counter, closing her eyes. But after a minute, she rose. Fear still hung in the air, but something else was already pushing it aside. Stubbornness. He'd given her a week. Well, then she had a week to find a way to stay. 7 days passed in one long, anxious moment. Ayana didn't give up. She worked in the store every day, from morning until night, as if nothing had happened. She watered the flowers, took orders, and even updated the display case with the brightest summer bouquets. The neighborhood hushed in anxious anticipation, but seeing her calm, people also tried not to panic. She called lawyers, wrote letters, but all the responses were vague and disappointing. Jin's power seemed invisible, yet absolute. At exactly the same hour as a week ago, the doorbell rang again, breaking the silence. This time, Jin entered alone. His footsteps creaked on the floor. He looked just as collected and cool, but a tense displeasure lurked at the corners of his lips. He hadn't expected her to still be here. Her stubbornness was bordering on open defiance, and he couldn't stand that. The store was spotless and full of life. This seemed to irritate him even more. Ayana stood behind the counter. She saw his reflection in the glass of the rose-filled refrigerator even before he walked in. She took a deep breath and turned around. They looked at each other silently for a few seconds. The air became thick and heavy. "You're still here," Jin said. There was no question in his voice, only a statement of an annoying fact. His patience, already thin, was wearing thin. "I'm still here," Ayana confirmed, raising her chin. "I warned you. Work begins today. And I warned you. My house will not be touched." He walked slowly around the small space of the store, his fingers lightly brushing the petals of a calla lily in a bucket. The gesture was strangely gentle for such a stern man. "You consider this a game?" he asked, not looking at her. "Your stubbornness against my resources? I consider it protection of my home," she replied. Jin turned sharply to face her. Something real finally flared in his eyes, a cold, controlled fury. He approached the counter so close that she could smell the cold scent of expensive cologne and steel emanating from him. "Okay," he said quietly, and his quiet voice sounded louder than any shout. "I have a new offer for you." "The last one." Ayana did not retreat, feeling her heart pounding somewhere in her throat. "What?" she squeezed out. Jin looked at her with a piercing gaze, as if assessing her one last time. "Marry me," he said clearly and slowly, "or I'll raze your neighborhood down to the ground. Every brick, every flower, starting with this shop." The words hung in the air, unreal and monstrous. Ayana felt the floor shift beneath her. She'd expected threats, pressure, but not this. This was madness. This was insulting and absurd. He looked at her without a hint of mockery, completely serious. This wasn't a romantic gesture, but a pure, calculated deal. The strangest and most merciless ultimatum imaginable. Shock washed over her like a wave, painting the world in white noise. But somewhere deep down, beneath the numbness, an ancient instinct kicked in, not to show fear to the predator, not to let him see that the blow had struck home. She forced herself to breathe. She forced her fingers, cold with terror, to unclasp the edge of her apron. She looked up at him, not in anger, but with a sudden, almost desperate defiance. If this was a game, she would play by her own rules. The ticking of the old wall clock filled the drawn-out pause. "Threatening me?" Ayana finally said, her voice surprisingly even, only trembling slightly on the last syllable. She paused briefly, collecting her thoughts. "Then bring me some flowers first." Now it was Jean's turn to freeze. His perfectly controlled face briefly expressed pure bewilderment. He blinked, as if he hadn't heard. "What? You heard?" Ayana said, a hint of adrenaline-fueled audacity creeping into her tone. She glanced at her flowers, then back at him. "You talk about marriage, about tearing down houses, but you always start with the basics. If this is your proposal, and not just a crude joke, then show at least a little good intentions. Bring me flowers, and then we'll see." She saw thoughts flicker in his eyes. He analyzed her words, searching for hidden meaning. A trap. He was used to fear, to rage, to submission. But not to this absurd condition thrown straight in his face. His lips pressed together. He looked her over again, from head to toe, as if seeing her for the first time. Then, without another word, Jin turned abruptly and walked out of the store. The door slammed behind him, with such force that the glass vases on the shelf jingled. Ayana was left alone. The trembling she'd been suppressing finally burst forth, and she grabbed the counter to steady herself. "Marry me!" The words rang in her ears, and then her own, even more absurd. "Bring me flowers!" What had she done? She'd just challenged the man who could wipe her world off the face of the earth, and in response to his madness, she'd offered her own. She didn't know whether to expect a bouquet or bulldozers tomorrow, but she knew one thing for sure. In this unthinkable fight, she had just made her first move. Jin left without a word. The door slammed behind him, and the store was filled with deathly silence, broken only by the frantic pounding of Ayana's heart in her ears. She stood there for several minutes, her palms pressed to the cold wood of the counter, trying to catch her breath. The words "marry me" still hung in the air, unreal and sharp as shards of glass. But then came another feeling, a sharp, almost dizzying relief. He was gone. He didn't break anything. He simply left. And her absurd demand, thrown out of desperation, seemed to puzzle him, maybe even anger him. "Bring me flowers!" It sounded like a refusal disguised as a joke, and he, this important and serious man, didn't know how to react. A faint smile touched her lips. Perhaps she had found his weak spot. He hadn't expected defiance in this form. He had expected fear, but he had received ridicule. Ayana spent the entire evening in a strange, nervous state. She locked the store, but couldn't sleep. She imagined his face, the momentary loss of control, the bewilderment in his usually icy eyes. It was a small victory, but a victory nonetheless. She thought she was rid of him, that his pride wouldn't allow him to stoop to fulfilling such a foolish whim. He'd probably simply wipe her neighborhood off the face of the earth tomorrow morning to prove his strength, and the thought brought back fear. But hope glimmered inside. What if he simply backed down, considered her crazy and inconvenient, and moved on to an easier target? The night passed in restless half-slumber. With the first rays of the sun, even before dawn, Ayana was already on her feet. She braced herself for the worst, the roar of engines, the rough voices, the sound of breaking glass. She donned her oldest apron, like armor. Her hands trembled as she reached for the lock. She slowly opened the door, and she froze. Before her lay a sea of flowers. Not a bouquet, not a basket, but a real, living, breathing sea. Right from the threshold, as far as the eye could see, stretched a carpet of uprooted rose bushes, their shoots hastily dug into enormous black plastic pots. Entire flower beds of marigolds, petunias, and alyssums were piled among them, cut out of the earth in squares like a giant multicolored puzzle. Nearby, uprooted peonies stood, their buds still closed, their heavy heads bowed. Further on, blocking the narrow street, stood trees in massive tubs, dwarf maples with delicate foliage, ornamental apple trees, their trunks wrapped in burlap. Fresh holes in the asphalt and black, damp earth were visible everywhere. The air, usually thick with the smell of coffee from the nearby bakery and exhaust fumes, was thick and intoxicating with the aroma of thousands of buds, greenery, and freshly dug soil. It was the entire garden from the city park, the same one 5 blocks away, where she had fed the ducks as a child, and where the empty lawns were probably now humming. Ayana couldn't move. She stood on the threshold, pressed against the frame, her mind refusing to comprehend what she saw. It was impossible. It cost a fortune. It required an army of workers, and an all-nighter. And all this, for what? To fulfill her stupid, in-your-face demand? And then she saw him. He stood in the very center of this frenzied floral invasion, next to a tub of white roses. John. He was wearing the same dark gray suit, but now fallen petals lay on the shoulders of his coat, and clay was caked to his perfectly polished shoes. He didn't look tired. He looked collected. Like a general on a battlefield, he just won with the most unexpected maneuver. Their gazes met across the sea of color and green. There was no mockery or anger in his eyes, only the same icy, expectant clarity. He stepped forward, carefully stepping around the uprooted hydrangea. His footsteps were silent on the soft earth. He stopped a few meters away, still surrounded by the ghostly garden. The silence between them was deafening, unbroken even by the birds. They had probably flown away too, deprived of their trees. Jin slowly surveyed in the madness created around him, as if introducing it to her. Then his cold, clear gaze returned to her face, frozen in mute shock. He bowed his head slightly. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet and even, but it rang out louder than any shout in this unnatural silence. "Your move!" Everything Ayana had built up in her head over the past night, relief, assumptions, the sliver of hope for escape, shattered on those 2 words. He hadn't backed down. He hadn't ignored her challenge. He had accepted it, and he had raised the stakes in ways she couldn't have imagined in her wildest dreams. He hadn't brought her a bouquet. He had brought an entire world of flowers, uprooted from their familiar place, and thrown at her feet. It wasn't a romantic gesture. It was a display of power, absolute and reckless. He had shown that he could change the landscape overnight, reshape reality, and now he looked at her, waiting for an answer. Her absurd demand had been fulfilled with a vengeance, with a scope that left her speechless. "Marry me, or I'll demolish your block." Now the proposal hung in the air between them, heavy and inevitable, like the scent of damp earth. He took his step, the most incredible and terrifying step, and then he handed it over to her. She stood in front of her flower shop, bathed in the morning sun, in the center of a botanical nightmare of aspiration, and understood that the game had only just begun, and the rules were no longer hers. Ayana stood in the threshold, and the world narrowed to 2 things, the overwhelming scent of a newly dug garden and the icy gaze of the man amid this madness. "Your move!" The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. All her hope that he would give in or ignore her challenge evaporated, leaving behind only a cold, sickening clarity. Jean wasn't joking. Not when he'd talked about demolishing the block. Not now, when he'd fulfilled her absurd demand, with such a sweeping sweep that it took her breath away. This floral apocalypse on her doorstep wasn't a declaration of love, but a show of force. He'd shown that nothing was impossible for him. And if he could move a park overnight, then razing a few old houses to the ground was a matter of 2 hours. The thought of bulldozers approaching Mrs. Kim's knitting shop or old Paulo's bakery was more acute than any fear for himself. She walked slowly out of the store, careful not to step on the uprooted plants. Her legs felt weak. She stopped in front of him, chin raised, searching his face for any hint of doubt, mockery, anything, but there was only expectant, merciless clarity. He had bought her time, paying for it with an entire garden. Now he demanded an answer. Despite the panic, fragments of thoughts began to stir in Ayana's head. Strategy. If retreat is impossible, the rules of the game need to be changed. This nightmare needs to be turned into something manageable. Okay, she said, her voice hoarse. She cleared her throat. You fulfilled the condition. Not in the way I expected, but you did. Jin bowed his head slightly, accepting this statement as his due. So, your answer is gah? He asked without emotion. My answer is we'll discuss it, Ayana retorted, feeling her insides tighten at the audacity of those words. No wedding, no nonsense. You talk about marriage as a deal, so it's a negotiation, and I have terms. A faint crease appeared on his forehead. He had apparently not been warned that, after capitulation, bargaining might begin. What? He asked, a slight steely note creeping into his tone. Ayana took a deep breath, looking around her flower cemetery. The first, most insane condition occurred to her on its own. First, you've removed the entire park from my street. It's a nuisance, and I can't handle this alone. She waved her hand toward the mountains of flowers. 3 days a week. You work here in the store. You do what I tell you. You study. There was a long pause. Jin looked at her as if she'd just spoken an ancient, forgotten language. His gaze moved slowly from her face to the small, cluttered bench behind her, then back again. Work, he repeated, as if tasting the strange word. Yes. Knead the earth, cut the stems, arrange the bouquets, wash the floors. 3 days, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, Ayana listed, gaining courage with each word. Without your people, just you. Otherwise, no deal. She waited for an explosion, expected him to laugh in her face and turn around, but Jean simply looked at her. He seemed to be making complex internal calculations, weighing humiliation against gain, weighing control of the neighborhood against scrubbing the floors of a flower shop. Can the days be changed? He finally asked in a businesslike tone. No, Ayana replied, almost choking in surprise. Did he discuss the schedule? Accepted, Jean said simply. What next? The first Wednesday began with a disaster. Jean arrived promptly at 9 in the morning. He was wearing simple dark trousers and a gray shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his elbows. It looked so strange, as if a king had disguised himself as a shepherd. He stood silently in the middle of the shop, awaiting instructions, his posture still screaming authority, completely out of place among the pots of geraniums. Ayana, trembling inside but maintaining an icy exterior, handed him an apron. It was a plain one, canvas, covered with tiny blue flowers. He took it, holding it between 2 fingers, like a suspicious piece of evidence, and slowly put it on. The image was so surreal that Ayana had to turn away to hide an unwelcome smile. Today, we're learning how to make a simple bouquet using the spiral technique, she announced, leading him to the work table. We'll use these: eucalyptus, spray roses, hypericum. Jin nodded silently. His movements were abrupt and uncertain. He gripped the pruning shears as if they were a dangerous tool and attempted to cut the thorns from the rose. The cut was crooked and the stem snapped. Not so much, Ayana said. It's precision that's needed here, not force. He glanced at her quickly. For the first time today, something other than neutral flickered in his eyes. Irritation. He picked up another rose. This time it worked a little better. Then the arrangement began. Ayana showed how to hold the first stem and twist the others at an angle to create a round, full bouquet. Jin tried. His fingers, probably accustomed to holding anything but flowers, felt clumsy and enormous. The stems wouldn't obey, slipping and breaking. He gritted his teeth, frowning in concentration. A light sheen of sweat appeared on his forehead. 15 minutes later, something vaguely resembling a bouquet lay on the table. It was crooked, several stems stuck out like unruly antennae, and the hypericum was squeezed so tightly together that the berries were about to burst. It wasn't an arrangement, but a floral prison. Ayana walked over and looked at his creation, then at his tense face. Well, she began. Terrible, Jin finished sharply for her, not taking his eyes off his failure. A rare, restrained frustration rang in his voice. He, accustomed to achieving everything on the first try, had suffered a clear and obvious defeat. From roses and greenery, Ayana said, unexpectedly, she suddenly felt almost sorry for him. This helplessness amidst simple things was unbearable. But yes, it's terrible. Take it apart and start over. Jin glanced at her. Something flashed in his eyes. Not anger, but more of a challenge. The same one that had burned within him when he'd ordered the city block demolished. He silently unpacked the crooked bouquet, carefully folded the damaged stems aside, and reached for new flowers. His movements became a little more careful, more attentive. Ayana turned away, pretending to mind her own business, but she kept an eye on him out of the corner of her eye. This powerful, dangerous man, focused on wresting a eucalyptus branch, was a far stranger sight than the entire dug-up park at her doorstep, and perhaps far more dangerous. Because in this struggle with the flowers, for the first time, she saw in him not just strength, but something human. And that was the most terrifying thing of all. Ayana couldn't contain herself when she saw the second bouquet, which Jin clutched in his fist as if trying to strangle her. A laugh escaped her. It was quiet, almost silent, but in the quiet of the store, it sounded like a gunshot. "I'm sorry," she breathed, covering her mouth with her hand, but her shoulders were still shaking treacherously. It's like a tulip has been through a hurricane and lost." Jin froze, still clutching his creation. He slowly looked up at her, and Ayana didn't see the anger she'd expected. She saw something entirely different, a subtle, barely perceptible hesitation. His eyebrows rose slightly, his lips pressed together, and for a second, a pure, childish awkwardness flickered in his gaze. He stood there in her silly apron, holding a scrap of ribbon in his other hand, looking not like a menacing boss, but like a huge, extremely unsuccessful schoolboy who'd been reprimanded at the blackboard. The look made her laughter die down. She coughed, trying to control herself. I'm not laughing at you. At the situation," she said, still feeling the corners of her lips twitching traitorously. "It's just a very sincere work. It has a mood of chaos." Jin looked down at his bouquet. He released his fingers. The flowers, finally freed, fell limply to the ground on the table. "It's a failure," he stated evenly, but it no longer held the steely confidence of his earlier days. It was a weary statement of fact. "I'm not in control of the process," Ayana asked unexpectedly. "This isn't your business. You don't need to command here. You need to feel." He looked at her, and that puzzled look returned to his eyes. Feel. It was probably a word not often found in his vocabulary, which was all about action and result. "Show me again," he said, instead of answering, pushing away the fallen bouquet. "From the very beginning," she showed him, for the third time. His fingers were less tense this time. He listened without interrupting, his gaze fixed on her hands. And when he picked up the flowers again, it was a little better. Still crooked, but no longer disastrous. That Wednesday, he left, as agreed, at precisely 6. Not another word about the deal, the block, or the marriage. Just a curt "see you Friday" at the door. But on Friday, he didn't arrive at 9. He arrived at 8 in the morning, when Ayana was just opening the shutters. He silently helped her carry buckets of water from the backyard. On Saturday, he showed up not only during the day, but also popped in the evening as she was closing the door, as if checking to make sure everything was all right. And then he started coming on other days. At first it was Monday. He simply walked in, nodded, took off his expensive coat, and hung it on a hook as if it were his daily routine. He said nothing. He walked to the back room, where a small table stood, and began sorting through the dried hydrangeas Ayana had set aside for the dried flowers. He did so silently, methodically. "You shouldn't today," Ayana noted cautiously, watching him from behind the counter. He didn't raise his head. "I know," he replied. "Are they bothering me?" She wanted to say yes, to say his presence was disconcerting, disruptive to her order, but that wouldn't be true. He was quiet, surprisingly unobtrusive. "No," she said finally, "just unexpected." "It's quiet here," he said after a pause, his fingers carefully separating the inflorescence from the stem. "You can think in the silence." They didn't speak again that day. He worked for 2 hours and left as quietly as he had arrived. After that, his visits on off-duty days became regular. He never asked permission. He never interfered. He'd simply arrive, put on an apron. He'd brought his own, a plain black one without flowers, which was a strange compromise, and do some monotonous task, cleaning pots, sorting bulbs, tidying up the fertilizer shelves. Sometimes he'd simply sit on a small stool by the entrance and look out onto the street while the store was empty. His enormous, usually imposing figure seemed smaller, calmer here. Ayana watched, at first with caution, expecting a trick, then with curiosity. She wondered what he saw in this silence, which he treasured. His own life, she guessed, must be deafening, full of calls, meetings, decisions that could not be made wrong. And here it smelled of earth and greenery. There was nowhere to rush. Here, the only problem was choosing between white and cream roses for the wedding bouquet. One Thursday, when a cold rain was pouring outside and the store was deserted, she found him standing in front of an open refrigerator filled with flowers. He didn't pick or touch them, he simply looked. At the vibrant splashes of tulips, the delicate crowns of hydrangeas, the intricate tendrils of orchids. His face was relaxed, almost detached. There was no calculation in his eyes, only contemplation. "It's beautiful, isn't it?" She couldn't help but ask quietly. He shuddered, as if forgetting he was not alone. He nodded slowly. "Yes, orderly," he said, which was an odd description, but she understood. There was a natural order to this chaos of colors and shapes. And he, a man whose life was likely built on iron control, found peace in it. He started leaving things behind. First, an expensive fountain pen on the counter. Then a Korean book he'd forgotten on the shelf with the dirt. As if these things, these little anchors, gave him the right to return. Ayana stopped flinching whenever she heard the doorbell or saw him at the door. She even started brewing an extra cup of coffee on Tuesday and Thursday mornings, even though he never asked. He'd simply take the mug, nod silently in thanks, and place it on his work desk in the corner. They barely talked about the main thing, that strange ultimatum that still hung between them like an unexploded bomb. They talked about the acidity of the soil for azaleas, about how to preserve cut peonies longer, about how the old weather vane on the house across the street had finally broken after the storm. It was a truce, strange, fragile, and silent. And Ayana, to her horror, realized she was beginning to get used to him, to his quiet presence, to the way his huge, initially clumsy hands now carefully wrapped bouquets in craft paper, to the fact that in her small world, which he had once come to destroy, he now had his own quiet place. And this frightened her far more than his initial threat, because a threat could be fought, but there was no defense against this quiet, methodical siege. Everything changed the day his people arrived. Jin was at the store on his off-duty Tuesday. He was sorting through a new batch of soil, carefully pouring it into bags, when two black SUVs abruptly pulled up outside. Ayana flinched, recognizing the vehicles. She braced herself for the worst, an intrusion, rudeness, her little sanctuary being violated once again. But no one came in. Three men in formal suits got out of their cars and simply stood frozen by the sidewalk, motionless as statues. They didn't look around. Their gaze was fixed on the glass door of the store, behind which Jean's back was visible, bent over a sack of dirt in a silly apron. Jin, probably sensing their presence, slowly straightened up. He didn't look surprised. He removed his work gloves, leisurely placed them on the shelf, and walked out the door without looking at Ayana. She froze behind the counter, watching through the glass. Jin was saying something, his face the same impassive mask it had been during their first meeting. But that wasn't what struck Ayana. What struck her was the reaction of his men. They stood at attention, their chins slightly raised, their gazes lowered. They weren't just listening. They were absorbing every word. When one of them, apparently the eldest, handed Jin an envelope, he did so with both hands, with a slight, almost imperceptible bow. Not fear of humiliation, but a deep, honed respect, mingled with absolute wariness, as if standing before them was not a person, but a force of nature, to be revered and to be displeased by. Jin took the envelope, nodded, and all three instantly turned and disappeared into their cars, which silently disappeared into the street. The entire episode took less than 2 minutes. Jin returned to the store. His face bore no trace of the icy authority that had just lingered on the sidewalk. He was simply Jin again, the one clumsily sorting through the bulbs. He went to the sink, washed his hands, and returned to his bag of soil, as if nothing had happened. But something shifted in Ayana's mind. Before, he'd been an abstract threat, then a strange, awkward student, then a quiet ghost seeking peace. Now she saw him in his natural context. She saw the true scale of who he was outside these walls. And the contrast between the serious, armed men trembling before him and the way he concentrated on brushing dirt from his apron inspired not fear, but a burning, almost unforgivable curiosity. Who was he really? And why did a man with so much power choose this absurd roundabout path, threatening marriage, working in a flower shop, just to get a piece of land? The question had been brewing inside her for days, like an abscess. He came, he worked, he left. They discussed humidity for succulents, but she caught herself studying his profile, searching for traces of that other cold life. Finally, on Friday, when he stayed after closing time helping her take out the trash, she couldn't take it anymore. They stood in the deserted store, illuminated by a single lamp above the cash register. Dusk was gathering outside. "Jean," she began, leaning against the counter, I've seen how your people treat you. He froze, holding the empty scrap bin in his hands. His gaze became wary, as if he sensed a trap. That's how it should be, he said simply. Ayana insisted. It's something else. And that makes me ask again, why? Why did you have to come here in person? Say all these wild things about the wedding and the demolition? You have people who would have done it quietly, without further ado. You could have just taken it. Why this strange spectacle? He set the bucket down. Something flickered in his eyes. A flash of something old and heavy. A shadow of that same icy fury she'd seen at first. But he quickly extinguished it. He turned away, pretending to straighten the label on the fertilizer crate. There are some things that can't be delegated, he said quietly, not looking at her. Sometimes you have to see the obstacle firsthand. An obstacle? Ayana snorted, feeling her irritation rising. So you thought of me as an obstacle in your path that you need to deal with personally? A scary little woman with pruning shears? He turned around abruptly. No, not like that. Then how? But he fell silent, his jaw tensed. He looked past her, into the dark corner of the store, as if there was an answer there he couldn't or wouldn't say. The air grew thick again, like the day they first met. It doesn't matter, he finally exhaled, his voice sounding unusually tired. The conditions are met. The process is underway. He didn't wait for her answer. He grabbed his coat from the hook and headed for the exit. He paused at the threshold but didn't turn around. See you on Monday, he said, and walked out into the gathering darkness. Ayana was left alone, with a deep sense of dissatisfaction and frustration. He had closed himself off again. He had become an icy wall again. And this angered her even more, because over the past few weeks, she had begun to think she was seeing something real. 3 days passed. Saturday and Sunday passed without word from him. On Monday morning, Ayana opened the store with a heavy heart, expecting him to either appear sullen and close or not show up at all, breaking this fragile truce. He arrived around lunchtime. He wasn't carrying a tool bag or documents. He was carrying a long, narrow cardboard flower box, neatly sealed. He silently handed it to her across the counter. His expression was inscrutable, but his eyes held that same cautious, expectant clarity. What is this? Ayana asked, not daring to take it. Open up, he said simply. She carefully removed the lid. Inside, nestled in damp moss, lay a single orchid, but it was unlike any Ayana had ever seen, not even in catalogs. Its petals were the color of dark, almost black chocolate, with a velvety texture, and from the center extended long, graceful tendrils, crowned with tiny, bright scarlet spots, like drops of blood in the night sky. It was frighteningly beautiful, rare, expensive, and infinitely complex. It's impossible, she whispered, touching a cool petal with her finger. This variety, it's not available for sale anywhere. Now there is, Jean said. He watched her reaction, watching her eyes widen with amazement and professional delight. Why? She asked, looking up at him. This wasn't like the grand, demonstrative gesture with the park. This was personal, quiet. He shrugged, looking away, suddenly looking embarrassed. You asked about reasons. I can't answer that in words. Maybe that's the answer itself. He didn't explain anything. He didn't say where he got the flower, how much he paid for it, or what it meant. He simply brought it. As an apology, as a continuation of a conversation he couldn't have, as a silent admission that she was more than just an obstacle. Ayana looked at the orchid, then at him. The ice wall was still there, but a crack had appeared, and a different light was shining through. He had brought her not a bouquet, but a riddle. Beautiful, rare, and as complex as he was. And in that moment, she realized she didn't want him to simply leave. She wanted to solve this riddle, and that scared her more than anything, because it no longer had anything to do with the safety of her neighborhood. It was personal. It all started with little things that Ayana initially wrote off as coincidences. The thieves who had plagued the neighborhood for months suddenly vanished without a trace. The old streetlight at the entrance to her alley, flickering for years, was repaired one morning. And one day, she saw 2 young men in sneakers too expensive for the area, but with stern foreign faces, help Mrs. Kim carry her heavy bags to the door. They nodded to Ayana, noticing her glance, and quickly disappeared around the corner. Then Paolo, the bakery owner, arrived. He came into the shop, not for flowers, but with a worried look. Ayana, do you know anything? He asked, lowering his voice. 2 people came to see me, polite. They said they were responsible for neighborhood safety. They asked if I had any problems. I told him about the broken windows in the back room. This morning, a new one was installed, perfectly installed. Ayana felt her fingers go cold. She knew whose people these were. Were they paid? She asked cautiously. No, Paolo waved his hands. They didn't even take coffee. They said all matters were resolved. "This is strange, Ayana. Very strange." It wasn't just strange. It was Jin's shadow cast across the entire neighborhood. He didn't ask permission. He didn't advertise his presence. He simply took everything she held dear under his protection, doing so tactfully, as if he understood that open interference would anger her, as if he were playing some complex game with her, where he dictated the rules but was careful not to hurt her pride. Ayana waited for a chance to ask him about it, but he behaved as usual. He came, he worked, he was quiet. And she didn't know how to approach him, say thank you, but he hadn't done anything for her personally. He had taken control of her world. Say stop? But how? People felt safe. The neighborhood slept peacefully for the first time in years. The truth was revealed by chance, by an old lawyer, Mr. Banks, who handled her grandmother's affairs. He stopped by the store to deliver some signed documents and seemed unusually agitated. "My respects, Miss Ayana," he said, looking around. "I must say, your patron moves with impressive speed." "What do you mean?" Ayana asked, alarmed. "Debts," Banks said simply. "The rent on Paolo's bakery, the loan on old Charlie's shoe repair shop, Mrs. Kim's mortgage, even my old debt to the office supply company. They were all bought out, in one lump sum. Completely legal, I might say. The neighborhood, you could say, is financially healthy." Ayana leaned against the counter to steady herself. The air suddenly became thick and opaque. "Ransomed? By whom?" Banks looked at her with mild confusion. "Well, the owner of all the land and property on this block, Mr. Jin. He sent notices to all tenants and debtors. Rents frozen at current levels for 5 years. Debts canceled. All very generous. Generous. Yes, it was generous. It was fabulous. Incredibly generous. Paolo no longer trembled every month trying to scrape together the money. Mrs. Kim wasn't afraid of losing the roof over her head. Charlie could continue working in peace. The neighborhood was saved. It would have prospered. It was safe. But it was no longer their neighborhood. It belonged to Jean now. Every brick, every window frame, every square inch of sidewalk, he hadn't bulldozed it. He'd bought it from the inside, quietly and efficiently. He'd saved it from ruin and now owned it completely, just as he owned her store. Just as by his strange ultimatum, he claimed ownership of her life, Ayana thanked Mr. Banks in a distant, robotic voice. When he left, she closed for lunch, posting a sign. She sat on a stool in the middle of the shop and looked at the orchid he had brought. Beautiful, rare, expensive, purchased and given as a gift. He had done what she had never even dared dream of. He had freed her friends and neighbors from the burden that had weighed on their shoulders for years. He had mended their world, but in doing so, he had gently but inexorably taken from them something intangible, yet essential, the sense of mastery over their own, albeit difficult, fate. They were now under his wing, in his debt, as was she. He didn't ask, he acted, because he could, because for him, it was as simple as buying a rare flower. And therein lay the essence of his strength and the entire tragedy of their situation. Ayana sat in silence, two emotions warring within her. A deep, all-consuming relief for her home, for the people she loved, and a cold, growing rage at being confronted once again with the fact. Her neighborhood had been saved, but the price of that salvation was becoming increasingly obvious and increasingly personal. She was trapped by his generosity. And the most terrifying thing was that part of her, the same part that had looked at the orchid and seen it not as a purchase but as a gesture. That part was grateful. The invitation came unexpectedly, exactly one day after she'd learned the truth about her debts. Jin, having finished watering the orchids in the display case, wiped his hands on a towel and, without looking at her, said, "This evening, at my place. I'll send a car at 8. It wasn't a question, but it wasn't an order, in his usual manner. It sounded like a logical continuation of something. Their strange lessons, the orchid he'd given her, the unspoken questions hanging in the air. Ayana wanted to refuse, to say she had things to do, but curiosity, that dangerous, irrepressible one, overcame her hurt and confusion. "Why?" she asked anyway. He finally looked at her. His gaze was calm. "To talk, without all this." He made a slight gesture with his hand, indicating the store, the street outside the window, their entire complex world, entangled in the unspoken. The car was dark and inconspicuous. The driver silently opened the door. They were heading not toward the luxurious historic mansions, but toward the new business district, toward one of the glass towers that soared into the sky. The elevator ascended to the top floor without stopping. His home wasn't a palace. It was a penthouse, vast and empty, polished dark wood floors, white walls, floor-to-ceiling windows, offering a dazzling panorama of the city at night, strewn with lights. Furniture was minimal, a low sofa, a couple of armchairs, a long table carved from solid stone. No rugs, no paintings, no knickknacks, no books. The air smelled of cleanliness, expensive wood, and the light, barely perceptible note of his cologne. It was beautiful, tastelessly expensive, and infinitely lonely, like a cage of glass and steel. "Come in," Jean said, taking off his jacket and tossing it over the back of a chair. He moved differently here, freer, but not more relaxed, like the master of a territory that had nothing to fear. Ayana walked slowly around the perimeter of the living room, her footsteps echoing dully in the silence. She peered into the open doorway. It revealed a modern kitchen with stainless steel appliances gleaming pristinely. Everything was perfect and sterile, as if no one had ever truly lived there. And then she noticed it. On a wide, low cabinet by the far window, where one would usually place something important to the eye, stood the only personal item in the space, a simple wooden frame. Within it was an old, slightly faded photograph. In it, a boy of about 10, his face serious and unchildlikely focused, sat at a large, polished piano. His fingers rested on the keys, but he was looking not at the notes but directly into the camera. And in his eyes, there was not the coldness that was typical of Jean, but something else. Anticipation? Uncertainty? Ayana asked quietly, not looking up from the photograph. Jean came over and stood next to her, looking at his childish reflection. He was silent for so long that she had already decided he wouldn't answer. "Yes," he finally said. "I was 11. Did you play?" "They made me. The teacher said I had talent. Did you like it?" He paused again, his gaze clouding. "I liked it when it worked, when the sounds came together as intended, in order." He turned away from the photograph and gestured for her to sit on the sofa. He sat in the armchair opposite her, crossing his legs. Between them on the floor lay a vast, patternless rug, as big as a lake. "You wanted to know why I chose this path with your neighborhood," he began, looking not at her but out the window at the shimmering city. "Direct threats, force. I've seen enough to last a lifetime. My family," he said the word without warmth, as if it were a term, "was in business, the kind where negotiations were often one-sided." Ayana remained silent, afraid to frighten away the rare frankness. It was their world, harsh, simple, built on certain rules. I was the heir, the only son. From childhood, they taught me the meaning of responsibility and duty. He paused almost imperceptibly, and Ayana remembered the debts of her neighbors he had bought. "I couldn't refuse, but I could change the methods, where possible." He looked at her. There was no justification in his eyes. There was the same tired clarity. Coming to you with people, throwing your things out into the street, that would be their way. The old way, effective, fast, but noisy. And it lacks respect. "Respect?" Ayana asked again, not believing her ears. "To something you didn't build, to something that has value for others." He spoke slowly, choosing his words carefully, as if it were a foreign, awkward language. "Your store, your neighborhood, it's not just square footage. It's a system with its own history, its own connections. It's easy to destroy, but managing the wreckage is more difficult than understanding how the system works and integrating it." He spoke of her life like an engineer about a complex mechanism. It should have sounded cold, but somehow she heard something else in his words. An attempt, crooked, clumsy, but an attempt nonetheless to do something different from what his past dictated. "So marry me?" she whispered. "Is this your attempt to integrate the system? The most inconvenient part of it?" The corner of his mouth twitched, almost a smile, but no. "It was a mistake," he admitted frankly. "Too direct a translation from my professional language. I wanted to gain control. Secure the asset. I suggested the first thing that came to mind as a formal legal connection. I didn't think about how it would sound. He didn't think. This whole nightmare, this whole game, started because he didn't think." Ayana felt a laughter welling up inside her, bitter and powerless. "You bought my world, Jean," she said, her voice shaking. "You paid off my debts. You surrounded it with your protection. You gave me an impossible flower, but you never asked if I wanted it. Not then, not now." He looked at her, and in his usually impenetrable gaze, she finally saw not just contemplation, but genuine, profound confusion, as if he were faced for the first time with a problem where all his logical processes failed. "What would you say if I asked?" he asked quietly. Ayana had no answer to this simple, terrible question. The silence was shattered by the crash of breaking glass. Not the sound of shattering shards, but the heavy, wet sound of something massive smashing through a display case. Ayana woke instantly, her heart pounding in her throat. She was lying in the small room above the store, her whole body tensed as she listened to the sounds below. First, footsteps. More than one person. Rough, not trying to be quiet. Then a dull thud, as if something heavy had been knocked over. The clang of falling metal buckets, the dry crack of breaking stems. They were in the store. The thought was cold and clear. These weren't random robbers. Robbers wouldn't have smashed everything around them so demonstratively. They were after money or valuables, not chaos. Ayana froze, listening. She heard rough, muffled male voices speaking a language she didn't understand. Then another thud, this time on the counter. The wood creaked and cracked. She had to call, who? The police? But what would they have time for? And she thought of Gene with horror. This was his doing, his world, bursting into her home. But calling him was the scariest thing of all, because his appearance would mean something irreversible. Violence. The answer. That same old way he'd talked about. But when the sound of ripping fabric came from below, the curtain on the archway, sewn by her grandmother, was being ripped. Her mind shut down. This no longer felt like a threat, but like sacrilege. She grabbed her phone and, with trembling fingers, found his number. It was saved simply, Gene. She never called him. He picked up the phone on the first ring. His voice was low and clear, without a trace of sleep. Ayana, they're in the store, she breathed out, not recognizing her own fear-twisted whisper. They're breaking everything. No questions. Just a sharp change in intonation, steel unsheathed. Where are you? Upstairs. In the room. Is the door locked? Yes. Don't come out. Don't move. I'm on my way. He hung up. The silence downstairs was momentarily replaced by new sounds. Someone was rummaging through the cash register, shaking out change. Then one of the voices grew louder, irritated. They apparently hadn't found what they were looking for. Or who. Ayana pressed her back against the wall near the door, freezing with every sound. She heard them climbing the narrow stairs to the utility room. Her room was next. She glanced around for something to defend herself with and saw only her grandmother's heavy copper watering can. She grabbed it, holding it in front of her with trembling hands. It was ridiculous and pointless. Footsteps stopped just outside the door. Someone pushed it open. The lock, old and unreliable, creaked. At that moment, the screeching of brakes came from the street. Not just one car, but several. Sharp, piercing sounds, tearing through the night silence. Then the slamming of doors, quick, precise footsteps on the asphalt. The footsteps outside her door died away. A short, abrupt shout rang out, and everyone in the store, judging by the sounds, rushed back toward the broken display case. There were screams, a brief struggle, muffled thuds. The whole thing took less than a minute. Then there was silence, thick, ringing. Ayana didn't move, still clutching the watering can. Her knees were buckling. Then she heard footsteps from below. One person, heavy but quick. They climbed the stairs and stopped in front of her door. Ayana, it's me, Jin's voice. But it wasn't the smooth, controlled voice she was used to. It was hoarse and oddly tense. Still trembling, she pulled back the bolt and opened the door. He stood on the narrow staircase. He wore a simple black turtleneck and dark trousers, as if he'd dressed hastily. His hair was tousled, but that wasn't what caught her attention. He was breathing slightly faster than usual, and his eyes, usually so unreadable, burned with a cold, absolute flame. There was no anger in them. There was something more terrifying, a deadly, focused purpose that was only just beginning to cool, giving way to something else. His gaze instantly swept her from head to toe, searching for signs of injury. Are you hurt? He asked abruptly. She shook her head, unable to utter a word. Then his gaze softened, just for a split second. Something like relief flickered in it, mixed with such a deep, personal rage that Ayana instinctively recoiled. He noticed this and immediately pulled himself together. The fire in his eyes faded, replaced by his usual restraint, but underneath it, tension still raged. Okay, he said quietly. It's all over down there. You can come down. He stepped back, giving her space. Ayana, still as if in a dream, walked past him and went down into the store. The scene was horrifying. The display case was a gaping hole, strewn with shards like ice. The counter had been overturned. Soil from the pots was scattered across the floor, mixed with trampled flowers and broken stems. Water from overturned buckets had spilled into puddles. The air smelled of dirt, broken greenery, and someone else's sweat. But the store was empty. No criminals, no people, just chaos. Jin followed him down. He stood amid the devastation, his face stony, but Ayana could see his fists clenched at his sides. Who? She whispered. Competitors. Stupid ones, he answered shortly, looking at the broken display case. They thought you were a weak spot, a way to put pressure on them. His words hung in the air. Vulnerable spot. She was his weakness, and because of it, her home, her memories of her grandmother, were turned into a garbage dump. Instead of fear, a wave of burning, impotent rage came. It's because of you, she blurted out, her voice trembling. It's all because of you, because of your games, your business. They broke into my house. He accepted her anger without looking away. Yes, because of me, and I'm sorry. His confession, quiet and sincere, momentarily disarmed her. She expected justification. Cold logic. Not this. I can't stay here, she said, her voice breaking. She looked at the trampled bouquet of wildflowers she had prepared for Mrs. Kim the night before. You're not staying, Jin said firmly. He came closer, but didn't touch her. Pack what you need for the night. You're coming with me. No, she wanted to say, but the words stuck in her throat. Looking back at the destroyed safe place and saying no was impossible. Fear, alive and sticky, still clung deep within her. And in his eyes, beyond guilt and responsibility, was the simple, undeniable truth. Here, now, he was the only protection. She nodded silently, feeling like she was betraying herself, her stubbornness, her independence. But the broken glass and trampled flowers screamed louder than any principles. He waited for her to fill a small bag, standing amid the chaos like a grim guard. And when she was ready, he gestured for her to walk forward toward the black car waiting at the curb, carefully avoiding the debris in her path. The road to the drive to the penthouse passed in oppressive silence. Ayana sat pressed against the door, looking out at the flickering city lights. She felt as empty as a broken glass case. Jin didn't try to speak. He sat leaning back in his seat, his profile sharp and tense in the streetlight. When they reached the top and entered the sterile silence of his home, the first thing he did was turn on the light and lock the door with the complex electronic lock. The click sounded like a death sentence. He turned to face her, and in the light of the overhead lamps, Ayana finally saw his face. There was not a drop of anger on it, nor was there the usual cold mask. His brows were slightly drawn together, and in his eyes, which never left hers, there was something she had never seen before. Pure, genuine concern, not for his business, not for his reputation. He looked afraid for her. This fear was so unusual and human on his usually impenetrable face that for a moment she forgot her own trembling. Sit, he said quietly, gesturing to the sofa. He walked into the kitchen. She heard him open the refrigerator and pour water. His movements were a little less precise than usual. He returned, placed a glass in front of her, and sat down in the chair opposite her, leaning forward with his elbows on his knees. Starting tomorrow, 2 people will be with you. Always. Discreetly. They will watch the store, your house. It wasn't said as an order, but as a statement of the inevitable. But Ayana shook her head. No. Ayana, no, she repeated more firmly, squeezing the glass in her palms. I don't want your people following me. I don't want to live in such a cage. Today they broke in because of you, and tomorrow your guards will become the new target. I won't feel safe. I'll feel like bait. He pressed his lips together but didn't argue. He understood her logic. Then you stay here, he said simply, until I sort this situation out. It's safe here. This time, she didn't refuse outright. The thought of returning to the apartment above the ransacked store, where the scent of fear and alien presence reeked of physical revulsion, and the sterile, soulless penthouse, no matter how cold, felt like an impenetrable fortress. She nodded silently, looking into the water in the glass. It was hard for her to agree, but it was the lesser of 2 evils. Jin showed her the guest room, as minimalist and clean as everything else. It had a bed, a built-in closet, and a door to its own shower. Everything necessary. Nothing extra, like a room in an expensive hotel where no one really lives. If anything happens, I'm here, he said, stopping in the doorway. Again, that same unfamiliar concern rang through his voice. Then he nodded and left, closing the door behind him. Ayana struggled to wash away the dust and the scent of fear. She pulled on the offered t-shirt, which was too big, and lay down on the unfamiliar, too soft bed. Sleep wouldn't come. Behind her closed eyes, the shards of glass, the crooked shadows on the stairs, the sound of tearing fabric floated back to her mind. She tossed and turned, listening to the silence of the vast apartment, and then she heard music. At first, they were isolated, timid notes, as if someone were hesitantly touching the keys. Then they formed a melody, slow, sad, infinitely lonely. It flowed from behind the wall, muffled but distinct. It was a piano. Ayana froze, listening. The music was beautiful, not technically cold, but piercingly alive, with pauses, a slight tremor in the low notes, as if the player was afraid to play too loudly, to disturb the silence of the night. She knew the melody, something classical, perhaps Chopin, but in Jin's performance, it sounded less like an exercise and more like a confession, like a quiet voice that can only be unleashed in complete solitude when no one is watching. She got out of bed and tiptoed barefoot into the dark hallway. Light streamed through the half-open door to the living room. She walked closer and peered inside. He sat at a large black piano she hadn't noticed before. It stood in the corner, In the shadows, Jean wore the same dark trousers, and his back was tense beneath his simple white shirt. He played without looking at his hands, his gaze fixed on the darkness beyond the windows. His profile, in the dim light of the desk lamp, seemed tired and vulnerable. This wasn't a boss, not a strategist, not someone who had just commanded the elimination of a threat. This was simply a man, the same boy from the photograph, forced to become someone else, and finding solace only here, in the black and white keys. The music stopped mid-sentence. He dropped his hands into his knees and sat there, motionless, his head bowed. Ayana involuntarily took a step back, and the floorboard beneath her creaked softly. He turned around instantly. His face was a smooth mask again, but his eyes still held traces of the same sadness that had filled the music. "Did I wake you?" he asked quietly. "No, I couldn't sleep," she answered just as quietly, not daring to enter. You play well." He looked at the keys, then back at her. "Thank you," he said, his voice holding a genuine slight awkwardness, like when she'd laughed at his bouquet. "It helps organize my thoughts." He stood up and covered the keys. The sound was soft but final. "Try to get some sleep. The morning will be tough." Ayana nodded and returned to her room. Now she knew what that sound of the lid closing had been. It was the sound he made, closing off a part of himself that almost no one saw, and she, against her will, had just witnessed it. Lying in the darkness, she could still hear that sad, beautiful melody in her ears, and she understood that the fear she felt for him was slowly, inexorably transforming into something far more complex and dangerous. Morning found them eating breakfast on a stone table overlooking the waking city. The silence between them was awkward, but not hostile. Ayana sipped the coffee he had silently prepared and looked at his focused face. He looked collected, but there were shadows under his eyes. "You play well," she finally said, breaking the silence. The words came naturally, bursting out of the night silence that still rang in her ears. Yesterday, the music was beautiful. Jin, who was just lifting his coffee cup to his mouth, froze. His fingers lightly gripped the fine porcelain. He didn't respond. Instead, his gaze, usually so direct, abruptly shifted, fixing it on the horizon beyond the window. He took a small sip and slowly set the cup down. He seemed to be digesting her words, like unfamiliar, slightly dangerous food. He said finally, his voice a little hoarse from the morning. He still didn't look at her. "No one has spoken like that since childhood." After it became clear the piano wasn't part of the plan, there was so much naked sadness in this confession that Ayana felt something clench inside her. She imagined the boy in the photograph, perhaps expecting praise, but receiving only a reminder of his duty. Having finished breakfast, he didn't put it off. Pushing his plate aside, he folded his hands on the table in front of him. His posture became businesslike, but his eyes weren't as icy as usual. There was determination. "Ayana," he began, his voice clear and unwavering. "I brought you trouble. I jeopardized your home and your safety. It shouldn't have happened. I can't change the past, but I can offer you a future." He paused, letting her understand the gravity of the moment. "I repeat my proposal. Officially, marry me. This will give you complete legal protection. It will become unprofitable for them to even look in your direction. You will get everything you want. The freedom to live as you lived. Money so you will never have to worry about debt. My power to protect you and your neighborhood. No one else will dare even come close." He didn't speak like a lover. He spoke like a strategist, offering what he believed to be the only perfect solution. And Ayana, listening to him, understood the terrible truth. He wasn't lying. Every word was sincere. In his world, that was the highest expression of care and responsibility. He was offering her a contract of complete safety, where his power became her shield. He was giving her all his resources, all but one. She looked at him across the table, this powerful, lonely man in his glass tower, trying to fix what was broken the only way he knew how, through control and ownership. "You'll give me everything I want." She repeated his words quietly, not as a question, but as a statement. "Freedom, money, protection." He nodded, watching her reaction. "Yes. What do you want, Jean?" she asked. Simple, straightforward. The question seemed to catch him off guard. He blinked, as if the words wouldn't form into a coherent sentence. His brows furrowed slightly. He opened his mouth to respond, probably with some prepared phrase about stability, about fulfilling one's duty, about being in control of the situation. But the words wouldn't come. He froze. His gaze, losing its anchor in hers, drifted off into the distance again, out to the window. But this time he saw nothing. His face reflected emptiness, a deep, fundamental confusion. He sat motionless, trying to find the answer to the most basic human question, and found nothing. His life, as he himself said, was one of duty, control, inheritance, responsibility to his family, his business, the people who depended on him. There was no room for personal wants. Desires were weaknesses, whims, things that got in the way of cold calculation. Did he want the neighborhood to be his? No. It was a strategic asset. Did he want her to marry him? No. It was a solution to a problem. A way to protect and secure her. What did he want for himself? Not for business, not for his reputation, not out of a sense of duty, simply for Jean. He was silent. The seconds dragged on in agonizing silence, and in that silence, Ayana saw the full tragedy of his existence. He could buy the city garden. He could wipe out the debts of an entire neighborhood. He could eliminate any threat, but he couldn't answer the simple question of his own desire. He didn't know. He literally didn't know what he wanted. Finally, he lowered his eyes, examining his own hands lying on the table, strong, accustomed to wielding power, and now so helpless. I didn't think about it, he finally managed, his voice low, almost embarrassed. It doesn't matter, Ayana said softly but firmly. Otherwise, this isn't an offer. It's a death sentence. For you and me. He looked up at her, and for the first time since they'd met, she saw in his eyes not calculation, not coldness, not anger, but something akin to genuine, burning fear. Not physical fear, but the fear of a man who suddenly realized that, for all his power, he lacked the answer to the most fundamental question, and that without that answer, everything he could offer was empty. The shop smelled of fresh earth and wax. Ayana had restored almost everything after the destruction. Work helped her not to think about his unanswered question, and about her own fear, which was now directed not at him, but at something vague within her. The cars pulled up quietly, but she recognized their sound, not the same ones from that night, different, more official. Through the window, she saw 3 people getting out, not those faceless thugs, but men in impeccable suits, carrying briefcases, advisors, strategists. The face of the eldest of them, a man with gray temples and a stern expression, was familiar. She had caught a glimpse of him on the sidewalk that time. Their gazes were heavy and serious. They didn't come in. They waited. A few minutes later, Jin pulled up. He got out of the car alone. His appearance froze Ayana in her tracks. He wasn't wearing a work sweater or a shirt, but a perfectly tailored dark gray suit, the same one he'd worn since their first meeting. His face was smooth, impenetrable, that icy canvas she'd almost forgotten over the past few weeks. Only a deep, unimaginable weariness lingered in the corners of his eyes. He said something briefly to his men, who nodded and moved back to their cars, giving them space. Then he entered the store. The bell rang a little too loudly. They stood facing each other in the restored but still fragile order. He didn't take off his coat. "I need to leave," he said without preamble. His voice was even, professional, but devoid of any warmth. "For a while. The enemy is preparing a major attack. They need my full attention." He spoke of business, of the very world that had burst in there that night and smashed her window. A world where he was not a man, but a force. "I understand," Ayana said quietly. Though she didn't fully understand, she only understood that it was important. "And dangerous." Jin took a step forward. His eyes finally met hers, and there was neither the icy clarity nor the night's confusion in them. There was determination, yes, but a sad, doomed one. "While I'm busy, I can't guarantee your safety 100%. And you won't accept security." He paused, as if gathering strength for the final words. His fingers tightened slightly. "Therefore, I cancel the deal. The ultimatum. That's it. You're free. The quarter will remain in peace. Legally, it will go to a fund managed by a neutral party. No one will touch it. Or you. You can forget about all this. About me." He spoke it clearly, like a sentence, as if he were cutting with a knife that strange, painful connection that had formed between them. He was letting her go. He was renouncing his own demand, his victory, because he couldn't protect her otherwise. Ayana felt the floor give way beneath her feet, not from fear, from something else. A sharp, piercing emptiness. He was giving in, not from weakness, but from, what? Responsibility? A sense of duty to her? She looked at him, at this man in an impeccable suit, standing among her flowers like a stranger. And suddenly other images swam before her eyes. Not this one, but the one in the rumpled apron, with a concentrated face, snapping rose stems, the one who sat silently in the corner with a book while she worked, the one whose clumsy fingers tried to tie a bow on the first gnarled bouquet, the one whose back tensed near the piano, drawing from it a sadness of such unbearable beauty. He'd spoken of a deal, of an ultimatum, of duty and control, but what she saw now, looking into his tired eyes, had nothing to do with that. He wasn't letting go of the obstacle or the asset. He was letting go of her because, somehow, her safety had become more important to him than his own plans, more important than his pride. He waited for her relief, her nod, her simple thank you and goodbye. But Ayana shook her head. Slowly, her heart was pounding somewhere in her temples. No, she breathed out. A slight, momentary confusion flickered across his face. He didn't understand. What? No. All the conditions will be. I don't agree, she interrupted him, her voice growing stronger. She took a step toward him. With your decision, you can't just announce something and then take it back when things get difficult. It's not difficult, he retorted sharply, and for the first time something alive, irritation, came into his tone. It's necessary so that you won't be touched. Who asked me what I want? She threw in his face, repeating his blow. You're deciding for me again. First, to marry you. Now, to forget you. Where is my choice? He froze, stunned. His logic, his flawless plan, was falling apart before his eyes because of her stubbornness. I'm offering you freedom! His voice rose half a tone, a hoarse note of despair filling it. Isn't that what you wanted? I wanted to understand, she shouted back, tears suddenly welling in her eyes. To understand why you started all this. And now I'm beginning to understand. You didn't come from beyond the earth. You came because you were tired. And you saw something real here. Something you didn't have. And you were afraid of it. And you decided to either own it or destroy it. Like you've done with everything in your life. Jin wasn't breathing. He stared at her with wide eyes as if she'd hit him. Ayana wiped her cheek with her palm, gathering her thoughts. Her voice grew quieter, but firmer. You said your move, so here it is. Don't break the deal. Don't cancel it. She took a deep breath. But let's start all over again. Not with a threat. Not with an ultimatum. Not with a deal. Let's start with a simple flower. Like normal people. The silence that followed her words was deafening. Outside, only the distant hum of the city could be heard. Jin stood motionless, his face pale. He digested her words, dismantling his defenses, his walls, piece by piece. He had expected anything. Fear, anger, gratitude, but not this. Not an offer to start over. Not an offer to just be. Slowly, ever so slowly, the ice in his eyes began to melt. Not immediately washed away, but receding, giving way to something fragile and new. Not cold clarity, not calculation, not fatigue. In his dark, deep eyes, which for so long had reflected only strength and loneliness, a tiny, timid glimmer appeared, a spark of something he seemed to fear within himself and long ago buried, a spark of hope. He didn't smile. He didn't nod immediately. He simply looked at her, and in that look was all his struggle, all his doubts, and, finally, quiet, utter defeat. Not before her, before the very possibility of another path. From a flower, he repeated quietly, hoarsely, as if trying out this strange, unthinkable beginning. Yes, Ayana whispered. Alone, just like that, for no reason. He nodded slowly. Almost hesitantly, once. It wasn't a businesslike nod. It was an agreement to capitulate and to a new, unknown country. And for the first time in a long time, something truly began to blossom in Jin's empty steel and glass world.